Not really sure what the legend is, but it's probably better not to know. Like many Americans, I have long had a general understanding of the shameful chapter in our history recounted by Daniel James Brown in his new book, Facing the Mountain. But sometimes a general understanding is a comfortable expedient. After Pearl Harbor, the United States government incarcerated more than 120,000 Japanese Americans and people of Japanese descent, two-thirds of whom were American citizens. Their families were ruptured, their families were humiliated, their homes and businesses stolen or destroyed. In an excess of euphemism, all of them, including the American citizens, were called enemy aliens. Their forced removals were called evacuations. And the concentration camps where they were confined were called relocation centers. Facing the Mountain reveals the layers of social and familial complexity that characterized this saga of betrayal, racism, and heroism. And the family stories, intimate and immediate, told by fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters who endured them, are truly heartrending. At the center of the book is the story of the 442nd U.S. Army Regiment, the most decorated regiment in the United States military history. It was comprised nearly entirely of Japanese Americans who were finally allowed to enlist in the war effort and who were repeatedly asked to fight the most brutal of battles while their parents declined in grim barracks, hoping their sons would return. Many did not. The 442nd lost more than 800 men killed or missing in action, a horrendous casualty rate. The list of their awards gives you an idea of that casualty rate. They were awarded 21 Congressional Medals of Honor, more than 4,000 Purple Crosses, 29 Distinguished Service Crosses, 588 Silver Stars, and more than 4,000 Bronze Stars, as well as 7 Presidential Unit citations. All of that in the face of grotesque bigotry at home, which was not at all dissimilar to the bigotry against which they were fighting. If Facing the Mountain reminds us of our worst qualities as a nation, it reminds us as well of what is possible when we are at our best and most honorable. And it underscores that patriotic cant is no substitute for genuine patriotism. A book of our times, a tired book marketing cliche that finds itself regularly into blurbs and onto book covers. Given the vitriol and hate that has been spewed across the American landscape during the past 6 years, I'd like to propose that, in fact, Facing the Mountain is indeed a book for our times. Please welcome to the Sun Valley Writers Conference, Daniel James Brown, who's the author of Facing the Mountain, The Boys on the Boat, The Indifferent Stars Above, and Under a Flaming Sky. And please also welcome Tom Ikeda, the Executive Director of Densho, an organization dedicated to the preservation of the history of the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans. Thank you, and please welcome them.
Good morning. And John, thank you so much for that introduction. It was a wonderful overview of what we're going to be talking about. And I also want to take the time just to thank the organizers of this conference. It's been just a truly wonderful, wonderful time. But Dan, the way I want to start this is we both love stories. And so I thought I would start with a short, a little story about how the two of us met. And it was about 6 years ago, almost 6 years ago, when Dan and I were on a stage similar to this. We were both in Seattle receiving an award from the mayor of Seattle, the Mayor's Arts Award. And I was receiving the award on behalf of Densho, a public history organization that collects and preserves the Japanese-American story, especially during World War II, to share this to promote equity and justice today. And you were there to accept the award for The Boys on the Boat. And I remember being a little nervous that day. Just speaking in front of crowds, I'm always a little nervous about that. But I think I was more nervous meeting Dan because I had read The Boys on the Boat, And it's become my favorite nonfiction books. The level of history and storytelling. And so when we were on stage, I remember us just chatting, and I distinctly remember leaning over and telling you that I really, really liked the book. And you surprised me when you said you were interested in the Japanese-American story. So talk about that and why this story after The Boys in the Boat.
Yeah, so, I remember sitting there and listening to you explain that what Tom's done basically is for the last 25 years, he's been videotaping, collecting, curating, and then making available on his website the first-hand accounts of Japanese Americans, as he says, particularly those who lived through the World War II era. And, I've always been interested in Japanese American history, but listening to what you were describing, I decided I wanted to check this out. So I went home that night and I started watching these oral histories, and I was just mesmerized by many of them. I'm all about stories. Stories what really matters to me, and these were stories that in many cases were deeply moving. I remember tearing up watching some of them. I remember laughing at a few of them. I remember being really inspired by a lot of these stories. And in a way, they reminded me, these were older men and older women talking about their experiences, young men and women, in the 1930s and the 1940s for the most part. And a lot of the stories I was hearing, they actually reminded me of some of the stories of the guys in The Boys in the Boat. There were themes of perseverance and endurance and resilience and people coming together from disparate backgrounds and learning to pull together towards an audacious goal. And so they just, I was just intrigued by these stories. And so that began a process of, I began to talk to Tom about the scope of the collection, and I was pretty perplexed about how to sort of narrow it down to something I could handle in a book.
And this was, for me, a real fun time. We have about 1,000 oral histories, and you were looking at those. I had conducted about 250 of these, so I knew the stories pretty intimately. And I've worked with over 100 authors, filmmakers, podcasters, curriculum developers who have been using these stories. And you did something different in that after you started looking at the stories, you would do additional research. You didn't just rely on what you found more easily from the Densho archive. You and your wife Sharon would go to these archives and find more. You would contact the families and get more materials. And at some point, we really became, I felt like, colleagues talking about these men as friends. But then it also was interesting because it was a hard time, or I thought this was going to be difficult, because the story is so vast. Just in the military service side of Japanese American history during World War II, you could have delved into the Pacific, Japanese Americans fighting in the Pacific, or the early origins of the 100th Battalion and their fighting, and as well as the whole camp experience. And I sometimes get lost in the details. There's just so much. So how did you decide what to do for Facing the Mountain?
Yeah, so that was the big challenge. There was such a vast amount of material. And I didn't really want to write a comprehensive history of the Japanese American experience. For one thing, I think that would be really presumptuous for somebody like me to do that. And it's not what I do. What I like to do is find very personal stories that shed light on an interesting part of history, and then use those stories to draw readers in and expose them to that history. So I knew I had to limit the scope in some way or another. So what I wound up doing actually was I realized that right after Pearl Harbor, right after the attack on Pearl Harbor, young Japanese American men, Nisei men, that is second generation, young men in particular faced a dilemma. Japanese Americans in general faced a dilemma, but young men of draft age felt it most acutely, I think. I mean, on the one hand, like millions of other young American men, they wanted to enlist in the military and serve their country. But when they went down to the selective service offices or the draft offices in their hometowns, they were told they were enemy aliens, even though they were American citizens, and that they could not serve. And at the same time, many of them, their families were being incarcerated, they were removed from their homes, having to sell their businesses off, their possessions off for pennies on the dollar, or simply give them away. This very traumatic experience of being forced from their homes was occurring. So others of these young men, the last thing in the world they wanted to do was support the American government so long as their families were being treated this way. And so they had this dilemma they had to wrestle through. And I wanted to write the book in such a way that, that I and we all could sort of understand the story through that lens.
Okay, so I thought it'd be interesting for the audience. We're going to take you on a little journey. We're going to look at some of the stories that Dan's talking about. And he focused on 4 men. And the first one we're going to talk about is Gordon Hirobayashi. And this is a photograph of Gordon at his wedding in Spokane, just a few hour drive away from here, to Esther Schmo. And yeah, Gordon's a really interesting character. So I'm going to let Dan talk about Gordon. Why is he in the book?
Yeah, so Gordon's a real interesting character. Gordon was a student at the University of Washington when the attack on Pearl Harbor happened. He was a young man of deep principles. He was a Quaker, and he was, even before the war began, he was a conscientious objector. And he lived his life very strictly according to these principles, and one of the most important principles for him was adherence to the American Constitution. So one of the first things that happened in Seattle and in many other West Coast cities was that a curfew was imposed on anybody of Japanese ancestry. They were not allowed to be out on the streets after 8 p.m. And one of the things that happened fairly early on was Gordon decided he just wasn't going to follow that curfew, and in fact he began to document occasions when he was out on the streets deliberately. And then when the time came for Japanese Americans in Seattle to be removed from their homes, put on buses, and taken away to these camps, Gordon just didn't get on the bus. He became the last Japanese American living in Seattle. And what he did instead was he sat down and he wrote really a beautifully crafted, very articulate statement outlining why he believed that the curfew and the incarceration of Japanese Americans were wrong and illegal and, most importantly, unconstitutional. And he took this statement and he went downtown Seattle and walked into the FBI offices there and turned himself in, handed this statement to the agent in charge. And they were absolutely perplexed. They were completely perplexed. They didn't know what to do with this young man. They took him around Seattle all day that day to different offices, trying to get him to sign a statement that would allow them to register him for incarceration. He just wouldn't sign it. So he wound up that night in the King County Jail in Seattle. And that began a period through the whole course of the war, basically, when he was in and out of jail or prison as he waged this legal battle that worked its way all the way up to the Supreme Court.
So we're going to show you a clip. This comes from an oral history done with Gordon about 21 years ago. And it's him talking about being at the University of Washington Library and his decision to defy the curfew. He's there with his white classmates, and there's again this 8 p.m. curfew. So it's like 5 minutes before 8 p.m. And here's Gordon telling the story.
Then one day, I'm dashing home. Hey, Gordon, it's 5 to 8. I grabbed my stuff, and it took about 5 minutes to get home. So I was just dashing home, and it hit me. A question that I should have faced earlier, it just hit me. How come I'm dashing home and all your timekeepers are still there? It just needed the question to be raised. I knew I couldn't answer it, without saying, I can't do it. I turned around and went back to the library. Hey, what's the matter? And I said, well, you guys are here. We got work to do. I said, I got work to do too. I decided if you guys are here, I'm gonna work with you. I'll go back when you guys are ready to go. Nobody turned me in. And I didn't take that until it hit me. And when it hit me, I knew, gosh, I can't do it. That's two-faced.
When I think of Gordon, he's such a remarkable man that as a young man, he's I believe about 20 at this point, being able to understand that and then to just stand up to the government was something that, really always, I just respected him so much. But I also want to mention that there were other resistors in the Japanese American community. Later on, we're going to talk about the men who fought. But the government came into the camps and they started drafting men to go into the army. And there were about 300 men who were called resistors of conscience. They believed that it wasn't right, and so they essentially said, get our parents and families out of the camps, and then we'll serve. And I just mentioned that because my wife's here, and her father was one of those resistors of conscience, and just wanted to acknowledge that. So Gordon was your way to talk about resistance. We're now going to talk about three other men, and they all served in the 442nd. And the next person we're going to talk about is Katsumiho. And the story of Japanese Americans in Hawaii aren't really well known, but there were more Japanese Americans in Hawaii than there were on the West Coast. And we hear about, as John said earlier, the 120,000 people incarcerated. There were over 140,000 in Hawaii, where Pearl Harbor was, and they weren't incarcerated. But talk about Katsumiho.
Yeah, so Katz, I got very involved with talking to Katz's family. So I'm very fond of him, even though he had passed on when I started this project. Katz grew up on Maui at a time when Maui was run basically as one large sugarcane plantation. And the plantation system, of course, was racially stratified, very brutal working conditions, very exploitative, particularly of first-generation Japanese and Filipino and other immigrants. So it was just a brutal system. Katz, though, by the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor, Katz had moved to Honolulu to attend the University of Hawaii, and he was there the day of the attack on Pearl Harbor. In fact, he witnessed the attack from the roof of his residence hall just across the street from the campus. And as he witnessed the attack, he heard a radio bulletin urging all ROTC cadets to assemble on the campus immediately, and he was a member of the Reserve Officer Training Corps. So he rushed across the street with several hundred other young ROTC men, most of them Japanese American. They assembled in a gymnasium or the armory there, and they were that afternoon formed into a thing called the Hawaii Territorial Guard. And they were issued old 1903 rifles and 5 cartridges, and they were told they would needed to go down to the waterfront to defend Honolulu against what everybody expected would be an imminent invasion of Hawaii, of Oahu, by the Japanese imperial forces. So he went down to the waterfront that night and began patrolling the waterfront. Even as he did that, though, back on Maui, his father was being led away literally at the point of a gun, and being incarcerated, and would be incarcerated for the rest of the war. But I think we're going to show a clip about how his service in the Territorial Guard came to an end.
Yeah, so this is a clip of Katsumiho talking about, the White Territorial Guard and, that the time that Dan talks about, plus another incident right after.
Our group of University of Hawaii students were dropped off as guards over area in the dark on 4-hour shifts, and for 2-3 nights in a row we were serving as, I don't know what we would have done, because we were given a loaded rifle. We were given a loaded rifle with 5 rounds of ammunition. We didn't even know how to fire the gun. But we were given this rifle. We were told, you load it this way, this is the way how you lock it, in case anything happens. And to this day I wonder, what was if anything happened was what they were referring to, because not that nothing happened, but what if anything had happened, what were we supposed to do, because we're not giving any kind of orders. A month and a half later, early in the morning, we got called up and said, hey, we're going to report down to Lanakila Intermediate School. And we woke up at about 2 o'clock in the morning. They woke us up at 2 o'clock. And then finally, about 5:30, a truck came by to pick us up. We were all fully packed and everything. We dropped us off at Lanakila. We wondered what was going on. We found out that the whole battalion was assembled at Lanakila. And then Major Frazier, who was the adjutant commander of the battalion, came up and told us point blank, right straight in our face, says, the reason why you are here this morning is because all you Americans of Japanese ancestry, I'm pretty sure he referred to it, Americans of Japanese ancestry, because of the ethnic background, you are being discharged herein, right off the bat, right as of now, you are being discharged from the Hawaiian territory. Only the AJAs. And completely still shocked.
Yeah, earlier, Dan, you mentioned, when you look at these oral histories, how sometimes you're laughing, and then at the next moment you could be crying. I mean, that's I think a good example of the ups and downs of some of the stories. And I love how he kind of talks about the absurdity of these young kids going out there not knowing how to fire these guns.
Yeah.
And they're going to stop the Japanese, right?
Yeah, the Japanese Navy. But also, just imagine that. I mean, the shock of this. These young men are in military. They're in uniform, like millions of other young American men. They're proud to be serving their country, albeit that they are not allowed to enlist in the regular army. And then all of a sudden, in the pre-dawn darkness on an athletic field in Honolulu, they're told that they're not welcome to serve anymore, that they're being discharged because of their ethnicity. And Katz and many of the other men who talked about that morning said that they could hear other young men in the darkness around them crying as they got this news. It was such a slap to the face to them.
Yeah. So let's go to the third person, Rudy Tokiwa, and Rudy is the soldier in the front leading these German soldiers. And so later on we'll hear more about his fighting in Europe. But this was a photo taken by the War Department where Rudy single-handedly captured all these Germans because they needed to capture some German soldiers to interrogate them. And this is a photograph of that. So let's come back to the mainland where Rudy grew up and talk a little bit about his life and the incarceration experience.
Yeah, so Rudy grew up in Salinas, California, on a farm, Rudy was a real character. His army nickname was Punch Drunk. He tended to get in a lot of scuffles. He wasn't real big on following army rules. And as a kid, he was pretty tough and rough and tumble. But he grew up on this farm in Salinas. His family was incarcerated. They were taken first to the Salinas Rodeo grounds, and then they were shipped off to one of these 10 concentration camps around the country. They were sent to the one at Poston, Arizona, a particularly hot, bleak, miserable camp. And his family was incarcerated there. And what happened was, as we mentioned, Japanese Americans were initially not allowed to enlist in the Army. But in early 1943, the Roosevelt administration reversed course, and they created a segregated all Japanese American fighting unit called the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. And when this was announced in the camps at Poston and the other camps, this set off a huge debate among the young men in these camps. Many of them did not want to enlist in the 442nd so long as they or their family members were incarcerated. Others, though, and Rudy was one of these, argued that that they should enlist and that they should serve, that perhaps if they fought in the war and bled, and it turned out to be many cases, died fighting for the U.S. Army, that when they came back, they would be greeted as heroes, their families would be treated better, they would be respected as equal Americans. So Rudy was one of those who enlisted in the 442nd and wound up fighting in Italy and then in France and Germany.
Yeah, before we go to Europe and the fighting, yeah, I just wanted to mention just a word about terminology, because you used the term, the Poston concentration camp, and John in the introduction used the term concentration camp. And I know for some of you that terminology may not be something familiar with you. And so the term concentration camp was used during World War II by U.S. government officials to describe these camps. Franklin Delano Roosevelt used it during press conferences. A Supreme Court justice used it in a opinion. Politicians, in newspapers. It wasn't until Americans found out about the death camps in Europe that people quit using that term concentration camp to hold Japanese Americans. And as a scholar and historians, we use the term concentration camp because, well, you oftentimes hear the term internment. And internment was a process that happened with the Japanese immigrants, as well as German immigrants and Italian immigrants, that were picked up right after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And there you had several thousand. But the 120,000 that went to the WRA concentration camps, 2/3 of those were U.S. citizens, and there was no due process. So I just wanted to mention that because I was getting some questions earlier about that terminology. But let's go to Europe and talk about, in particular, there was this 1 month in October 1944. Talk about that and the fighting that the 442 did.
Yeah, so as I say, the 442nd fought initially in Italy. They fought their way from Anzio up to the Arno River, series of very challenging battles, always fighting their way up some hill or another against German forces, took a lot of casualties, and earned a very favorable battle record. I mean, they were immediately or almost immediately recognized as an extremely effective force. But then they were shipped to northern France, to the French-German border, the Vosges forest. And they were given the mission of liberating a town called Bruyères, which was the intersection of a railroad and a couple of highways, important strategically. By now it was November of 1944. It was cold and dark and snowing and raining and muddy and miserable fighting conditions. So they fought for several days, again taking very heavy casualties, but they did liberate Bruyères, and they moved beyond Bruyères a little deeper into the Vosges forest and liberated a couple of villages, Bifontaine and Belmont, all the while taking even more casualties. After that sequence of several days of very intense battle, they were given leave to find a shed or a barn or someplace to take a few hours or a night or two to rest and recuperate. But on the second night, they were awakened in the middle of the night and told to put their combat gear back on, that they were going back into battle. And so 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, they were assembling, wondering what was going on. What was going on was that the commanding general of 141st Infantry, the Texas, they often called the Texas Army. These were young men, mostly from Texas and Oklahoma. Their commanding general, General Dahlquist, had ordered several hundred of them too far out into the Vosges forest on a ridge line. They'd been cut off and surrounded by German forces and were trapped there. And over the course of the next several days, they'd begun to die. Many of them were wounded. They had no medical supplies, very little in the way of food, no drinkable water, and they were just in a terrible situation. Dahlquist sent a number of other 141st units, Texas units, up to try to get them out. None could break through. So finally, in the middle of that night I mentioned, he called up the 442nd All-Japanese American combat team and sent them up the mountain. They fought for several days under absolutely hellacious conditions, fighting their way up the side of this mountain, and again taking very, very heavy casualties. It's actually a very dramatic battle. They did finally break through and get through to the Texans and get the Texans down back off the mountain. But then Dahlquist ordered them to keep advancing even further into the Vosges. And so they continued to take casualties for several more days before they were finally brought down back off that mountain. And we're going to show you a clip of what happened at that point.
Yeah, so Rudy is going to talk about the aftermath of that. So General Dahlquist, after the 442 finally came down, ordered them then to have what's called a retreat parade. He wanted to acknowledge, the 442 for saving the rescue or the lost battalion. At full strength, the 442nd is about 4,000 men. On that day, after they had fought, liberated Brières, all the battles that Dan talked about, they were down to about less than 800 men left standing. The level of killed in action, wounded, sick, trench foot, it was just horrendous. And here Rudy talks about the reaction of the general when he saw the 442.
The 36th Division commander wanted the 442nd to pass in review. And he said, all personnel of the 442nd will pass in review. So the 442nd passes in review, and like I say, you got 3 battalions plus headquarters, and they don't even have a battalion out there passing in review. So General Dahlquist turned around and he said to the colonel, when I order everyone to pass in review, I mean the cooks and everybody will pass in review. And Chaplain Yamada said, this is the first time I saw the colonel cry. And he said, this is all I have left.
And this is always a hard clip for me to look at. I did this interview with Rudy, and he continues to tear up and cry, because he talked about all the men who were lost, and then in his mind to be disrespected by the general. And the irony that Rudy talked about more was how his family was still in a camp, the Posen concentration camp, and many of the men that died, had families in these camps, and just the irony. And later on, Dan, you even talk about how some of these men liberated a death camp in Germany. So it's the ironies are just so rich.
Yeah, and that clip. I mean, I remember. As I say, I was looking at all these clips trying to decide who to write about and how to focus the book. And I remember tearing up myself when I saw that clip. I remember Sharon teared up first time I showed it to her, and it was one of those. The moment I saw that, I knew Rudy had to be a part of this story. He was a really tough guy, but he also just had this huge heart, and I think readers are going to find him a particularly interesting character.
Yeah, that's hard. Just a side note, because I noticed, Lori Takahashi, you're in the audience. I interviewed your father, and he was in the 442. He was one of the men who came right after that battle as a replacement troop to bring the 442 back up to full strength. And I remember asking him the question, what did he see in the men that came off that mountain? And he talked about he said literally they looked like they were insane. It was just the toll on them was just so hard. Next we want to talk a little bit about the post-stress, the trauma and all that, with another person that was highlighted, and this is Fred Shiosaki, who grew up in Spokane. What's interesting to a lot of people is that if you were east of the Columbia River, like in Washington State, you weren't placed in one of these concentration camps. And so Fred grew up in Spokane, so if you were a Japanese American in Idaho, for instance, before the war, you weren't placed in a concentration camp. But Fred's story is a little bit different, so Dan, tell us about Fred Shiosaki.
Yeah, so Fred grew up in a neighborhood in Spokane called Hilliard, which is down by the railroad tracks. And it was a pretty tough neighborhood, actually. It was mostly immigrant families, immigrants from all over the world. And I think partly as a result of that, a lot of ethnic slurs got thrown around by the kids in that neighborhood. Fred was a really sweet guy, and he wasn't a guy, I think, who was particularly inclined to fight, but he wouldn't abide ethnic slurs thrown at him. And so he was always coming home with his eyeglasses broken. His family ran a laundry in Hilliard, and he was always getting in scuffles with the neighborhood kids who provoked him or who taunted him along racial lines. But he was a really nice young man and nice older man as well. Fred was one of those who immediately after Pearl Harbor went down to the Selective Service Office in Spokane and tried to enlist, and was told that he couldn't enlist, he was an enemy alien. And he was absolutely shocked by this. He literally could not understand how an American citizen could be also an enemy alien. So he was crushed by that decision. He spent the next year attending Gonzaga University in Spokane. But that was kind of humiliating for him because he was one of very few young men on the campus. All his high school classmates had all gone off to war, and so he found it an absolutely humiliating experience. But then in spring of 1943, when the 442nd Regimental Combat Team was created, he rushed to enlist. He and Rudy Tokiwa were both members of K Company. That assault on the mountain to rescue the Lost Battalion was led by two companies of men, K Company and I Company. And Fred and Rudy were both members of K Company. So Fred was one of the 17 from K Company who managed to come back down off the mountain alive and still ambulatory. But it was an absolutely horrific experience for him. And we'll see a clip here in a second where he talks about how it affected him.
Yeah, so here Fred talks about returning home. So this is the war has ended. He's returned from Europe. He's on the East Coast taking a train back to Spokane, so a cross-country train ride. But he has a stop in Washington, D.C., and he happens to meet one of the soldiers from the Lost Battalion.
I was on the train by myself, and we stopped in Washington, D.C. And I was actually, from that railroad station, you could see the Capitol building. I'm sure that must have been the Union Station. And I was sitting there looking out the window, and this GI came out, I think he's a buck sergeant, and he stopped and he looked at me and he looked at my patch. He says, "Hey, you were there for 42nd." Yeah. I says, "Were you at the Lost Battalion?" And I said, "Yeah, I was there." He says, "I was in there."
So he was one of the 200 men that you rescued.
Yeah, anyway, it's one of those things. I could just feel myself getting I was angry, God, and I turned to him and I said, "Do you know how many men we lost getting you guys out of there? You know how many of my friends died in there?" And well, he said, you know, if you guys were in there, we'd have come after you." And I shook my head and I said, "Well," he said, "Anyway, I want to thank you." He put out his hand and I turned away and looked out the window.
Yeah, Fred goes on and talks about how, he kind of regretted his action. He was ashamed that he couldn't shake his hand, but he also talked about how angry he still was. So after the 442 rescued the Lost Battalion, they didn't really get a chance to actually see each other, because the 442 was then ordered back into the hills to keep fighting while the Lost Battalion came off. So this was Fred's first chance to meet someone with the Lost Battalions. It was very hard.
It was, and I mean, I think that clip shows these guys came home, as millions of GIs did, with not just physical wounds and scars, but psychological scars. Actually, all the guys I read about, to some extent, had some degree of PTSD after the war. Fred, for instance, after the war moved back into the laundry in Hilliard, the apartment above the laundry with his folks, and I know for that first year or so after he got home, his mom had to keep awakening him in the night or coming to him in the middle of the night because he was screaming in his sleep. So, it took a heavy toll.
And for many of the Japanese American soldiers, I mean, not only did they have to deal with that, but they had to come back, many cases to the West Coast, to a lot of racism. They had to come back in situations, even though that they had just fought for the United States, they returned to places like Seattle, Spokane, and the general population still viewed Japanese Americans as the enemy. And so, imagine that. And so the men and women and families that were in the camps, they also had to return home to those situations. So as much as we talk about the wartime experience of Japanese Americans and how difficult it was, for many of the Japanese Americans, I'd say even for most of them, that post-war, what we call the resettlement period, was even more difficult. And there you saw, not only with these soldiers, but a lot of the inmates from the camps who committed suicide and things like that. It was just a very, very difficult time. Dan, when you were writing this book, I mentioned how we met almost 6 years ago, and the country was going through an incredible amount of political turmoil, social unrest. We would spend a lot of time emailing back and forth about things that were happening in the country. I remember, hearing at that point, I think the candidate, Donald Trump, talking about the rapists and murderers, from Mexico. And I remember writing to you about how this resonated with a lot of negative rhetoric about Japanese Americans during World War II. We also had the Muslim travel ban, where the government used not military necessity, but national security as a reason why we wouldn't, let Muslims travel between, predominantly Muslim countries and the United States. Then we had the family detention and separation at the southern border, and all these things were happening. And how did that affect you and in your writing of this book?
Yeah, I mean, I had the same experience. I was doing this research and interviewing people, talking to family members by day and fleshing this story out. And then I'd come home in the evening, or I was actually staying at home. I'd come out of my office and watch the evening news, and there were so many echoes between what I was researching and writing about and what I was seeing on the evening news, every day. It was just, it really alarmed me, and It didn't change the content of what I was writing about, but it made me feel an increasing sense of imperative to get the story written and to write it well and to get it out into the world. And I have to say that I grew up in California. My father was involved in the flower business, so we had many Japanese American friends and family business associates. And so I grew up thinking I had a pretty good awareness of what the Japanese experience on the West Coast had been. But it was really in the process of writing this book that I found out how much I didn't know. And part of it was just sort of the depth of the history of anti-Asian rhetoric and sentiment in this country. I was reading about, doing sort of a deep dive in and reading about the era in California when Chinese immigrants came in the late 1894, 1849, 1850s, excuse me. And the outright violence that they met, the lynchings and the burnings and people being driven out of their homes, and the kind of rhetoric that was directed at them. And I was learning more and more about this era around the turn of the century when this notion of the yellow peril arose in our newspapers, and a little later in Hollywood, where Asian immigrants were equated with vermin, with locusts and snakes and rats, and in particular with bringers of disease. And as I was reading this and learning this and understanding it more deeply, as I say, I was coming home and I was hearing the same kind of rhetoric being used again in our political discourse, time after time. And so I began to realize, in a way I hadn't before, that there's certain images and tropes and phrases and associations that arose a century or more ago in this country, associating Asians with these things. And they've stuck in the American consciousness, and they've been recycled and used again and again. So in the wake of Pearl Harbor, the racism that arose and the vicious cartoons and caricatures of Japanese and Japanese Americans, those were already there. They were just brought up and recycled and used again against these people. And even more disturbingly, in the last few years, it's the same kinds of images and associations, particularly this notion of disease and associations with disease that the Trump administration has weaponized and used against, and others have weaponized and used against Asian Americans. So it's been a revelation to me, actually, and it's helped motivate me through the writing of this book to try to tell that story, as I say, as well and as clearly as I can, and also to make it personal, to introduce my readers to these young men and all that they sacrificed for this country and all that they and their families went through.
No, thank you. And I think John said this also well in the introduction, and why this book is so important to read really right now. It's not just this piece of history. It really helps us think about what's going on today. In a few minutes, we're going to have a chance for some questions for Dan or me. But before we do that, just a couple days before we were going to speak, I had them add one more slide to the presentation. We're in Idaho, and I thought it would be important for people to know that just 80 miles south of here, near Twin Falls, there was the Minidoka, Idaho concentration camp. And this was a camp that my parents, both my parents, all four of my grandparents were incarcerated. They were in Seattle before the war. They were rounded up, first went to the Puyallup Fairgrounds and held there for several months, and then brought to Idaho. It was there that my mom's oldest brother, my uncle, volunteered for the 442nd and fought. He was killed in action fighting in Italy. And this is a photograph that was taken at Minidoka of my grandparents, the two on the left, accepting the American flag, at the ceremony, the memorial ceremony. What's interesting to me, and I did some research on this photograph, there was no military official to present the flag to them. So another Japanese immigrant, did that honor, and little minor things in terms of military protocol. A military official mentioned to me how there should not have been a piece of paper underneath the flag. The flag is supposed to really be next to the flesh as part of the protocol. And the backstory too, in terms of my family, my uncle, who was in the ROTC program at the University of Washington, volunteered as quickly as he could. And when he went to his physical, he failed it with a kidney ailment. My grandmother gave him a home remedy, so he passed the physical. And my uncle was very proud and went to serve with the 442. But when he was killed, my grandfather was so despondent, so angry that, and this is the story from my mother who was there, my grandfather lashed out at my grandmother and said that, she essentially killed, their son. And so we have these stories. It was such a difficult time for the community. And I just wanted to, and I brought this photograph in some parts for you, Dan, because there is such a gratitude from me and so many people in the community that you've taken the time to tell this story. That this story is just electrifying the Japanese American community, because it is such a powerful story. And Dan did such a wonderful job in telling it. So again, thank you so much for...
None of this would have happened, Tom, without you. But I also just wanted to point out that this is a scene that was repeated over and over in these 10 concentration camps, where military officials brought flags or performed some sort of ceremony. At some point, somebody came in past a barbed wire to inform a mother and a father that their son had died in Europe, even as they themselves were living behind barbed wire. And Tom mentioned, this isn't something we usually work into the talk, but I think it's important to bring up that very late in the war, the artillery unit from the 442nd was detached from the 442nd and sent to participate in the drive into southern Germany, into Bavaria. And as scouts for the artillery unit, some of the 442nd artillerymen were among the first people to arrive in the area of Dachau in Bavaria. And in fact, they were the first people to liberate not the main camp at Dachau, but Dachau was actually a complex of slave labor camps spread over many, many miles. And they were able to participate in the liberation of some of those camps, Nazi camps, at the same time that their own families were still living behind barbed wire. And I just think the irony of that is something that should not go unnoted.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And thank you all for being here and listening to the story. It means a lot to, I think, both of us that you're here. So thank you very much. Thank you. So at this point, we're able to take questions. Are there any questions that people have? Let me stretch a little bit. Well, as people are thinking, I have another question for you, Dan. We talked about 4 men, but you also talked about the stories of women. In particular, I think through maybe the Katsumiho story. Talk about some of the women in this.
Yeah, so I mean, because I focused on, deliberately focused on young men of draft age, of course, the principal characters are exactly that. They're young men. But they all had families, and as you can see in this photo, their families were are a very important part of this story, and they played a variety of roles. One of the really interesting female characters in the book is Katsumiho's sister, Fumie. Fumie, like Katz, grew up on Maui in the plantation system. By the time she was college age, she was absolutely fed up with the racial stratification in Hawaii. And so she decided to move or to attend university in Japan. So she moved to Japan a couple of years before the beginning of the war. And then when the war broke out, she was essentially trapped in Japan. And so she, of course, was there, and she witnessed it from the Japanese point of view, and witnessed over the course of the next few years how very difficult life got in Japan. So by 1945, in order to escape the firebombing in Tokyo, bombings in general, she and her in-laws, when she moved to Japan, she had a sister who was already in Japan. She lived with her and her husband. So Fumie and her in-laws moved to a village just outside of Hiroshima. And at this point, they were living in really Spartan conditions. I mean, they were trying to find roots to eat, and it was just really tough living conditions. But Fumie did have a job in central Hiroshima. On the morning of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, she missed her usual train into the city center. So she was still at the train station waiting for the next train when she saw the mushroom cloud arise over the city. And of course, this was extremely traumatic for her. She literally, and she and the people around her could not comprehend what they were seeing. I mean, they literally couldn't make sense of it. Nobody had ever seen anything like that. So she was completely shocked. She went home and she rendezvoused with her sister. They were both in tears, trying to understand what had happened. The next day, though, Fumie had a close friend who worked with her in the city. Fumie decided she was going to try to get into Hiroshima to see if she could find her friend and her work colleague. And so she made her way into the center of Hiroshima, and of course there was nothing left really to the center of Hiroshima. She spent the next several days wandering around in the ruins, trying to tend to these horribly burned and wounded people, trying to give them some sort of aid or succor. And you know, and it was an absolutely transforming experience for her. She eventually returned to the United States. She had lost her U.S. citizenship, but she was eventually given her citizenship back. And she spent the rest of her life traveling around the world as a pacifist, preaching, for peace. And just a remarkable character of herself. And somebody actually, I had access to this sort of series of personal memoirs about her life, none of them published, but they were a wonderful source. And then her niece, Carolyn, or Mariko, was another source. Just a fascinating woman in her own right.
Great. No, thank you. Yes, we have a couple of questions here, I think. Need to get a microphone.
Do we have a mic anywhere? It's coming down the aisle.
Here's some coming down. Okay. We'll go there and then to you, sir.
I had a question about my recollection is the 442 was led by officers who were essentially Caucasians, who were not involved in the internments. What was the relationship or the compassion between these commanding officers and the men that they led?
Yeah, great question. I think you covered that in your way. So it was the relationship between the officers, the Caucasian officers, and the men.
So it was interesting, actually. They were very split. It very much depended on the officer and the men. Rudy Tokiwa, their immediate commanding officer for Rudy and his group was Lieutenant Colonel Purcell. And Rudy was very skeptical of this big, tall, bluff Caucasian guy when he first met him. But he came to absolutely love and admire Purcell very deeply, and most of the men under Purcell did, in fact. He was right up there front with those guys. When they made the final assault on the position around the Lost Battalion on that mountain, Purcell actually got up. He had an ivory-handled pistol, and he pulled his pistol out of his holster, and he said, "Let's go," and he started up the hill ahead of any of the rest of them, and it inspired those guys to go up that mountain. Rudy, for instance, and many of the men absolutely adored him. As far as General Dahlquist goes, I don't think there was a man in the 442nd that ever forgave him for not just the situation around the Lost Battalion, but just sort of the general lack of respect. And there were other instances where many of them felt that they had been treated as cannon fodder. And I see we got time's up here.
Okay, I'll just answer. Let's do this one last question because, please.
Is this on?
Yeah.
This is not a question, it's a comment. I have a friend by the name of Cressy Nakagawa. He is obviously of Japanese extraction. He was born after the war. His father owned a very large farm in California, a very successful farm. And his father and the rest of his family were incarcerated. The men who owned the adjacent farm came over to him and said, "Give me $1. I'm going to buy your farm. And when you get back, you give me the $1 back, and I'll give you your farm." And he said, "That's how I got my farm. I was born after the war," he said. "That's how I got my name, my given name, because it was Mr. Cressy who owned that farm, who gave it back to my family in tip-top order." My point I'm making is that there were some good people out there, unfortunately not enough.
Yeah, and I just would add that Rudy Tokiwa's family had a very similar experience. Rudy's parents had befriended a couple of young men who ran an adjacent farm. They had lost their parents tragically at a young age, and Rudy's father sort of taught them how to farm. And so when the Tokiwa family was forced off their farm, this pair of brothers from the adjacent farm said, put your stuff in our barn, we'll take the pet dog, and so on and so forth. And so when they came back, most of their possessions had been safeguarded, and it worked out well. So yeah, there were folks that did the right thing. At the same time, when Bainbridge Island in Washington State, for instance, news first came out that Japanese Americans there were going to be removed from the island, there were people driving around in trucks taunting their Japanese American neighbors and trying to buy their possessions, for pennies on a dollar. My father, as I said, was in the flower industry. When many of his customers and friends came back, their greenhouses had been smashed, their possessions had been looted, and so yeah, there were people who did the right thing, but there weren't enough of them.
Well, thank you, Dan, and again, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.